The Second World War had plunged the world into chaos by 1940. Nazi Germany, under Adolf Hitler's totalitarian regime, had unleashed a wave of conquest that swept across Europe with terrifying speed. Poland fell in 1939. Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries and France collapsed in 1940 under the relentless force of the Blitzkrieg, Lightning War, that combined tanks, mechanized infantry, and air power in a devastating formula. By the summer of 1940, only Great Britain stood defiant on the western edge of Europe, its shores bracing against a possible German invasion. The United States, still officially neutral, watched warily from across the Atlantic. But by December 7, 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and Germany declared war on the United States days later, America was thrust fully into the global conflict. President Franklin D. Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill began planning not just for defense, but for eventual victory, a victory that would require the liberation of Nazi-occupied Europe. From the earliest days of America's involvement, both Roosevelt and Churchill agreed on a fundamental strategic goal. The defeat of Nazi Germany was the key to winning the war. But how to achieve that was fiercely debated among the Allied leaders and their military chiefs. Churchill, haunted by the slaughter of World War I trench warfare, initially advocated for a peripheral strategy, striking at the axis through North Africa, the Mediterranean, and the so-called soft underbelly of Europe. The Americans, led by General George C. Marshall, Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, argued for a bold, direct approach, a cross-channel invasion into northern France that would strike at the heart of Hitler's empire. It was a vision that would eventually prevail, but only after long debate, intense planning and careful build-up of the necessary manpower and material. The invasion, when it came, would be the largest amphibious operation in history and the most complex military undertaking ever attempted. The decision to launch a cross-channel invasion, codenamed Operation Overlord, began to solidify in 1942. That summer, a disastrous raid on the French port of Dieppe by Canadian and British troops underscored the immense challenges ahead. Of the 6,000 men who landed, more than half were killed, wounded or captured. Tanks bogged down on the shingle beach, naval support proved inadequate, and air cover insufficient. Yet, painful as it was, Dieppe provided invaluable lessons: the need for overwhelming firepower, detailed intelligence, specialized landing craft, and meticulous coordination. Meanwhile, the Allies focused on building strength. Operation Torch, the Anglo-American invasion of North Africa in November 1942, marked the first major step toward opening a new front. Success there paved the way for the invasion of Sicily, Operation Husky, in July 1943 and the subsequent campaign in Italy. These operations tied down German forces, provided battle experience to US and British troops, and demonstrated the value of amphibious assaults, albeit on a smaller scale than what Overlord would demand. At the Casablanca Conference in January 1943, and later at Quebec and Tehran in 1943, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin hammered out the broad outlines of Allied grand strategy. Stalin, whose Red Army bore the brunt of the fighting on the Eastern Front, demanded a second front in Western Europe to relieve pressure on his forces. Roosevelt and Churchill promised to deliver it in 1944. Thus was born Operation Overlord, with a target date of May 1944, later pushed to June due to weather and logistical considerations. The man chosen to lead this monumental undertaking was General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, a calm diplomatic leader capable of managing a vast coalition of forces and personalities. Planning for Overlord began in earnest in the spring of 1943. The basic concept was clear: an amphibious assault across the English Channel from southern England into northern France, establishing a secure beachhead from which the Allies could pour men and material into continental Europe. But where should they land? German intelligence expected the invasion to come at the Pas de Calais, the shortest crossing point and closest route to Germany. That very expectation worked in the Allies' favor. Instead of Calais, the planners chose Normandy, farther west along the French coast. Although the crossing would be longer and the tides more complex, Normandy offered several advantages: weaker German defences, suitable beaches for landing large numbers of troops, and access to the deep-water port of Cherbourg once inland objectives were secured. The plan called for 5 beaches stretching more than 50 miles along the Normandy coastline. From west to east, they were codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Utah and Omaha would be assaulted by American forces. Gold and Sword would be taken by the British. Juno would be stormed by the Canadians. The scale was staggering. Nearly 5,000 ships and landing craft, 11,000 aircraft, and over 150,000 troops would take part in the first wave alone. Millions of tons of supplies had to be gathered, thousands of vehicles prepared, and entire divisions trained in amphibious landings. But brute force alone would not guarantee success. Surprise, deception, and meticulous coordination were equally vital. To that end, the Allies launched Operation Bodyguard, an elaborate deception campaign designed to convince the Germans that the invasion would strike elsewhere, particularly at Pas-de-Calais. A fictitious 1st U.S. Army group, complete with inflatable tanks, dummy landing craft, and false radio traffic, was created in southeast England under the nominal command of General George S. Patton. German reconnaissance planes dutifully photographed these forces, and the German High Command remained convinced Calais was the target even after troops landed in Normandy. Meanwhile, the Germans prepared for invasion. Hitler had long feared a second front, and in 1942 ordered the construction of the Atlantic Wall, a massive system of coastal defences stretching from Norway to the French-Spanish border. Under the direction of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox now tasked with defending Western Europe, the Germans planted millions of mines, built bunkers and gun emplacements, and installed deadly obstacles on likely landing beaches. Rommel, a realist, believed the invasion had to be stopped on the beaches themselves. "If we do not succeed in the first 24 hours, he warned, we will lose the war." He pushed for more troops near the coast, more armour held in reserve close to the beaches, and more obstacles to hinder Allied landing craft. But his pleas clashed with the strategic preferences of other German commanders, including Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who favoured holding armoured divisions farther inland for a massive counter-attack once the invasion site was clear. The resulting compromise left German defences formidable but flawed, strong in places, weak in others. In Britain, preparation reached fever pitch. Entire regions of southern England were transformed into vast military camps. Roads and railways groaned under the weight of convoys transporting men, tanks, ammunition, and fuel. Ports teemed with landing craft and transports. Factories worked around the clock to produce the material of war. Specialized equipment was developed to overcome the formidable obstacles awaiting the invaders. British engineer Major General Percy Hobart oversaw the creation of the famous Hobart's Funnies, modified tanks designed for specific tasks. Some were equipped with flails to detonate mines, others carried bridges to cross anti-tank ditches, and some were outfitted with flamethrowers to clear bunkers. Floating harbours called mulberries were designed to be towed across the channel and assembled off the beaches to unload cargo until permanent ports could be captured. Massive underwater pipelines known as Pluto, pipeline under the ocean, were built to pump fuel directly from Britain to France. Air power would play a decisive role. Allied bombers pounded railway lines, bridges, and airfields across northern France to disrupt German movement and supply. Paratroopers and glider-borne infantry trained for nighttime drops deep behind enemy lines to seize key crossroads, bridges, and causeways before the main landings. By the spring of 1944, the Allied force in Britain numbered more than 3 million men from a dozen nations: Americans, Britons, Canadians, Poles, Free French, and others, united in a common cause. The invasion fleet, known as Operation Neptune, the naval component of Overlord, assembled in the ports and harbours of southern England. It was an armada unlike anything the world had ever seen. Originally scheduled for May 1944, the invasion was postponed due to the sheer scale of the preparations and the need for favourable conditions: a full moon for paratroopers, low tide for beach obstacles, and calm seas for landing craft. The chosen date was June 5, 1944. But as D-Day approached, a violent storm swept across the Channel, forcing Eisenhower to delay the assault by 24 hours. On the night of June 4th, in a tense meeting with his commanders, Eisenhower faced the most consequential decision of his career. Meteorologist Group Captain James Stagg forecast a brief break in the weather on June 6th. The window was narrow, perhaps only 24 hours, but it might be enough. Eisenhower listened to his generals' debate. Then, after a long pause, he made the call. "Okay, let's go." The order set in motion a chain of events that could not be undone. Across England, troops boarded landing craft. Paratroopers prepared to leap into the night. Naval guns were loaded. Thousands of men wrote final letters home. The invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe, the greatest gamble of the war, was about to begin. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, as the winds calmed and the clouds broke over the English Channel, Operation Overlord, years in the making, roared into action. The greatest armada in history, codenamed Operation Neptune, stretched from horizon to horizon, more than 5,000 ships and landing craft, carrying 156,000 troops, supported by 11,000 aircraft and thousands of vehicles. At that moment, the future of Europe and the fate of millions rested on the courage, discipline, and determination of those men. Shortly after midnight, the first blows of the invasion struck inland from the beaches. More than 23,000 American, British, and Canadian paratroopers leapt from the darkened skies or landed silently in gliders behind German lines. Their missions were critical: seize key bridges and roads, disrupt enemy communications, and prevent German reinforcements from reaching the coast. The U.S. 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, under Major Generals Matthew Ridgway and Maxwell Taylor, dropped across the Cottontin Peninsula behind Utah Beach. Chaos reigned in the darkness. High winds scattered units miles from their drop zones. Gliders crashed in fields and hedgerows, and many soldiers landed in flooded fields, drowning under the weight of their gear. Yet despite confusion and heavy casualties, small groups of paratroopers rallied, captured vital causeways, and harassed German positions, sowing fear and uncertainty behind enemy lines. Farther east, British paratroopers of the 6th Airborne Division achieved one of the most remarkable feats of the night: the seizure of Pegasus Bridge over the Caen Canal and Horsa Bridge over the Orne River. Landing gliders within yards of their objectives, they overwhelmed the German defenders in minutes, securing the bridges and preventing German armored units from counter-attacking the eastern flank of the invasion. Their success ensured that the path inland from Sword Beach would remain open. At 05:30, the thunder of Allied naval guns shattered the dawn. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers unleashed thousands of shells on German coastal defenses. Off Omaha Beach, the battleship USS Texas fired salvo after salvo at bunkers and artillery positions. British ships like HMS Belfast and HMS Warspite pounded gun batteries overlooking Sword and Gold beaches. Offshore, rocket-firing landing craft loosed devastating barrages at the beach defenses. The naval bombardment was intended to destroy German fortifications and demoralize the defenders before the troops landed. It inflicted significant damage, but not enough. Many bunkers survived intact, machine gun nests remained operational, and artillery pieces continued to menace the approaching landing craft. The men heading toward the beaches would still face a storm of fire. At the westernmost sector of the invasion, Utah Beach, the U.S. 4th Infantry Division, under Major General Raymond O. Barton, began landing around 06:30. Strong currents and navigational errors pushed many landing craft nearly 2,000 yards south of their intended zone, a mistake that turned out to be a blessing. The area was less heavily defended, and the troops encountered lighter resistance than expected. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., the only general officer to land with the first wave, immediately recognized the situation. "We'll start the war from right here," he famously declared, and directed the troops inland. Within hours, the Americans had linked up with airborne forces, secured the causeways, and pushed several miles inland at the cost of just 197 casualties, a remarkably light toll compared to other beaches. The landings at Omaha Beach, however, were another story entirely. Here, the U.S. 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, and 29th Infantry Division faced the most formidable German defenses of the invasion. The sector was defended by the battle-hardened 352nd Infantry Division, which had reinforced the area just weeks before D-Day. Bunkers, pillboxes, trenches, and machine gun nests lined the bluffs overlooking the beach, supported by artillery and mortars. At 06:30, as the first wave approached, disaster struck. Many amphibious tanks, crucial for providing fire support, sank in the rough seas before reaching shore. Naval bombardment had failed to destroy most of the German defenses. As the landing craft ramps dropped, the men stepped into a maelstrom of bullets and shells. Entire units were cut down before they reached the waterline. The beach offered little cover, only shingle banks and steel obstacles. The carnage was relentless. Companies were decimated. Officers and NCOs were killed within minutes, leaving units leaderless and confused. Wounded men drowned in the rising tide. Medics worked frantically under fire to save the wounded. For hours, Omaha seemed on the brink of disaster, a potential catastrophe that could imperil the entire invasion. But amid the chaos, small groups of men pressed forward. Rangers of the 2nd and 5th Ranger Battalions scaled the cliffs at Point du Hoc, destroying German gun positions that threatened the beaches. Infantrymen crawled through minefields, blasted gaps in barbed wire, and stormed pillboxes with grenades and flamethrowers. Naval destroyers, moving dangerously close to shore, poured direct fire into German strongpoints. By late afternoon, at terrible cost, over 2,400 casualties, the Americans had secured a tenuous foothold on Omaha. The price was horrific, but the beachhead held. The invasion would not fail here. To the east, British and Canadian forces faced their own brutal battles on the beaches of Gold, Juno, and Sword. At Gold Beach, the British 50th Infantry Division encountered strong resistance from entrenched German forces, but, with the help of Hobart's specialized tanks and effective naval gunfire, managed to break through by midday. By nightfall, they had captured the town of Arromanches, where engineers would later construct one of the vital Mulberry harbors that sustained the Allied advance. At Juno Beach, the Canadian 3rd Infantry Division suffered heavy losses in the first waves, with many landing craft destroyed by mines and artillery. Yet, the Canadians pressed forward with characteristic determination. By the end of the day, they had advanced farther inland than any other Allied unit, nearly 10 miles in some sectors, despite losing over 1,000 men. On Sword Beach, the British 3rd Infantry Division, supported by commandos, faced fierce opposition from German artillery and the elite 21st Panzer Division, one of the few armoured units close enough to launch a counterattack on D-Day. By afternoon, British forces had linked up with paratroopers holding Pegasus Bridge and repelled the German assault. The beachhead was secure, though the critical objective in the city of Caen remained in German hands and would take weeks of brutal fighting to capture. The German reaction to the invasion was slow and confused. Hitler, convinced that Normandy was a diversion and that the main blow would fall at Pas-de-Calais, refused to release panzer divisions held in reserve. Communications were disrupted by Allied bombing, and many senior commanders were away from their posts, including Rommel, who was in Germany visiting his wife on her birthday. By the time the German High Command grasped the scale of the invasion, it was too late to mount an effective counterattack on D-Day itself. The scattered and piecemeal German responses failed to dislodge the Allies from their beachheads. By nightfall on June 6th, over 156,000 troops were ashore in Normandy, supported by thousands of vehicles and tons of supplies. The beachheads were linked, and the Allies had established a solid foothold in France. The landings were only the beginning. What followed was a brutal, grinding battle for the future of Europe. The city of Caen, a key objective on D-Day, became the focus of intense fighting. British and Canadian forces launched repeated assaults throughout June and July, meeting stiff resistance from the 12th SS Panzer Division and other German units. Caen finally fell on July 9th, but only after devastating air bombardments and weeks of street fighting. To the west, American forces aimed to capture the port of Cherbourg on the Cotentin Peninsula. After fierce fighting through the bocage, a maze of hedgerows and narrow lanes ideal for defense, Cherbourg fell on June 26th, providing the Allies with a deep-water port to sustain their growing armies. The battle for Normandy reached its climax in Operation Cobra, launched by General Omar Bradley's 1st U.S. Army on July 25th. After a massive aerial bombardment shattered German defenses near St. Lo, American forces broke through the German lines and surged into the open countryside. The breakout threatened to encircle German forces, leading to the Falaise Pocket, where tens of thousands of German troops were killed or captured in August. On August 25, 1944, Paris was liberated. The German army, battered and retreating, fell back toward the Rhine. Within months, the Allies stood on Germany's western frontier, while the Soviet Red Army advanced from the east. Less than a year after the beaches of Normandy ran red with blood, Nazi Germany capitulated. On May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, VE Day, was declared. The cost of Operation Overlord was staggering. Allied casualties on D-Day alone numbered over 10,000, with more than 4,400 dead. German casualties were estimated at 4,000 to 9,000 killed, wounded, or missing. Thousands of French civilians perished in the fighting and bombardments. Yet the invasion's success marked the turning point of the war in Western Europe. It opened the long-awaited Second Front, forced Germany into a two-front war it could not sustain, and paved the way for the liberation of Nazi-occupied Europe. Operation Overlord remains one of the most extraordinary military achievements in history, not just for its scale, but for its complexity, coordination, and human cost. It was the culmination of years of planning, innovation, and sacrifice. It required the cooperation of multiple nations, the ingenuity of engineers and strategists, the bravery of ordinary soldiers, and the determination of leaders who believed in a free world. For those who landed on the beaches of Normandy, June 6, 1944, was more than a date. It was a moment when the course of history shifted. Amid the chaos and carnage, courage triumphed over fear, and the forces of freedom began their march toward victory. As General Dwight D. Eisenhower later reflected, the tide has turned. The free men of the world are marching together to victory. Today, the beaches of Normandy are quiet. The guns are silent. The bunkers stand as relics, and the cemeteries stretch across the rolling fields, rows of white crosses and stars of David marking the resting places of those who gave everything. But the legacy of their sacrifice endures. The victory achieved on that day reshaped the world, secured the downfall of tyranny, and reaffirmed the enduring truth that freedom is worth the highest price.